The Haunting of Leap Castle. I don't know what possessed us to move into Leap Castle. Perhaps it was the allure of its history, the promise of a fresh start in the Irish countryside, or the grandeur of the old stone fortress looming proudly over the rolling green hills. But from the moment we stepped through those heavy iron gates, I felt it. A weight in the air. A presence I couldn't quite explain but couldn't shake either. It was 1922 when we arrived, my wife, our young daughter, and me. Leap Castle had stood for centuries, surviving wars, rebellions, and countless tragedies. The local villagers had warned us, more times than I cared to count, about the spirits that lingered within its walls. But we were from the city. Practical. Unafraid of old superstitions. At least, that's what I told myself. The first night, everything seemed normal, albeit eerily quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet you find in a peaceful countryside, but the kind that makes your skin prickle with an inexplicable sense of dread. We unpacked what little we brought with us and settled in for the evening, eager to begin our new life. My daughter's laughter echoed through the empty halls, a brief reprieve from the silence that pressed down on us from all sides. But then, the sounds started. It was just after midnight when I first heard it, soft, almost like a whisper. The sound of footsteps moving across the stone floors just outside our bedroom door. At first, I thought it was my wife. I turned over, expecting to see her, but she was there beside me, fast asleep. My heart quickened. I lay there, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening for any other sound, but there was nothing. Just the suffocating silence of the castle. Eventually, I managed to convince myself it was nothing more than the creaking of old wood, the settling of the ancient stone. I drifted back to sleep, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. The next day, strange things began to happen. Doors that had been securely closed were now ajar. Furniture had moved, ever so slightly, just enough to make you question if you had left it that way. My wife brushed it off as our getting used to the place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until that night that I realized how right I was. We had just finished dinner, and my daughter was playing with her doll by the fireplace. I was lost in thought when she suddenly looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Daddy, who's that man?" she asked, her voice trembling. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Just the three of us. "Sweetheart, there's no one here," I said, trying to sound calm. She shook her head, her tiny hand gripping her doll tighter. "He was right there, by the window. He was looking at me." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness, but all I saw was the empty courtyard bathed in moonlight. "There's no one there," I said, trying to reassure her. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time. Closer. They seemed to be circling our room, pacing just outside the door. My wife and I lay in silence, both of us too afraid to speak. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if something was watching us. Then, the door to our room creaked open. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the dark hallway beyond. I got up, determined to prove to myself that it was nothing, just the wind or a draft. But as I stepped into the hallway, I felt it, something cold, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway. Tall, shadowy, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it looked as though it had been through unimaginable suffering. But it was the eyes that terrified me the most, empty, hollow, yet filled with a rage so intense, it made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the figure slowly began to move toward me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Gone. As if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew that whatever it wasn't finished with us. We weren't safe. Not in Leap Castle. And as the night stretched on, I realized with a growing sense of dread that the horrors of this place had only just begun. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the ancient stone walls, sent my heart racing. My mind was consumed by the image of that figure at the end of the hallway, its hollow eyes burning into my soul. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting. Morning brought little comfort. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances over breakfast, neither of us willing to speak of the terrors that had unfolded the night before. But the silence between us was heavy, loaded with unspoken fears. Our daughter, thankfully, seemed oblivious to the tension, her innocent laughter the only thing keeping me tethered to some semblance of normalcy. But Leap Castle was far from normal. As the day wore on, the oppressive atmosphere only grew worse. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was a constant chill in the castle, no matter how many fires we lit. I tried to distract myself with tasks, inspecting the castle grounds, exploring the many rooms and corridors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see that figure again, standing there, waiting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the castle was bathed in the dim, eerie light of dusk, the real terror began. We were sitting in the great hall, trying to settle in for the night, when we heard it. A low, guttural moan that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the castle. My wife's eyes widened in fear, and I could see her hands trembling as she clutched the armrest of her chair. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the sound came again, louder this time. Closer. It was coming from deep within the castle, from somewhere far below us. I grabbed a lantern and motioned for my wife to stay with our daughter. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." She nodded, her face pale, as she gathered our daughter in her arms. I tried to keep my voice steady, but inside, I was terrified. Something in this castle was awake, something ancient and malevolent. I descended the narrow, winding staircase that led to the lower levels of the castle, the moaning growing louder with each step. The air down here was damp, musty, and colder than it had any right to be. The lantern's light flickered as I reached the bottom, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls. I found myself standing before a large, iron door, one that I hadn't noticed before in all my explorations of the castle. The door was ancient, rusted with age, and seemed out of place, as if it had been added long after the castle was built. And behind it, the moaning continued, a sound so filled with pain and anguish that it sent shivers down my spine. With trembling hands, I reached for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. It took all my strength to pry it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. As the door swung open, the smell hit me first, a foul, rotten stench that made me gag. I held the lantern up, the dim light barely penetrating the thick darkness beyond. What I saw in that room will haunt me for the rest of my days. The chamber was vast, lined with rough stone walls that seemed to close in on me the longer I stared. And there, in the center of the room, was a pit, a deep, gaping hole in the ground. The source of the moaning. I approached the edge of the pit cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the cold, empty space. The smell grew stronger as I neared it, a sickly sweet odor of decay and death. I peered over the edge, holding the lantern high. And that's when I saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe more, piled one on top of the other in the depths of the pit. Some were little more than skeletons, their bones twisted and broken, while others were eerily preserved, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The moaning was coming from them, from the bodies. Their mouths were open, though no breath should have escaped their decayed lungs. Yet, the sound persisted, a chorus of agony rising from the depths of that cursed pit. I stumbled back, horrified, dropping the lantern. It shattered against the stone floor, plunging the chamber into darkness. I could feel them now, hands, cold and clammy, reaching out from the pit, brushing against my legs, trying to pull me down with them. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, up the stairs, through the winding corridors, until I burst into the great hall, gasping for breath. My wife was there, standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're in the walls." I looked up, and that's when I saw them. Faces. Dozens of faces, pressing out from the stone walls of the castle, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Their eyes, empty, hollow, followed us as we stood there, frozen in terror.